Welcome back, guys. So we're going to be looking at Unit 13 now, the Gunpowder Empires. As is obvious, probably by the name, these are the empires that develop after the fall of the Mongol Khanates. And for the most part, the power and the authority of these empires is based on their possession and their development and their innovations in using gunpowder weaponry. And this gives them a pretty significant advantage over the other civilizations that they come into contact with because gunpowder in the 15th century is still a relatively new invention, other than in China, where it's been, developed and slowly articulated over a couple of centuries. But in terms of the rest of the Eurasian continent, Europe, Africa, gunpowder is still relatively new on the scene. And it's actually going to be those other civilizations, specifically Europe, with its political fragmentation, its constant war, um, the Muslim world, with the constant conflict between the Ottomans and the Safavids and the Mughals, they're going to be the ones that actually drive innovations in gunpowder. And pretty soon they're going to become the leading forces in terms of gunpowder weaponry, while China, who has a relatively stable geography where they're not really threatened or challenged by any other states or any other powers, that complacency is going to cause them to begin to lag behind in gunpowder technology, which they invented. So before we get into the unit, there's quite a bit of supplemental viewing here. This unit is going to be what we call a survey unit. There's no specific event that we're driving towards. There's no specific kind of cause and effect here. What we're doing is kind of just surveying the different civilizations and the different societies that develop in the 15th century after the fall of the Mongols. And each one of them is significantly affected by the fall of the Mongols. The dissolving of the Mongol Khanates creates a power vacuum in a lot of these areas, and you're going to see new peoples and new nationalities step into those vacuums and take power away from the traditional people who had held power in those areas. Okay. So under the recommended supplemental viewing, obviously Crash Course number 20 deals with the building of a Russian Empire. 217 deals with the Mughals and their, and people's viewpoints of them in history. The 10-minute history on the Ottomans is pretty good. It gives a pretty good detailed explanation of their empire. And then the Khan Academy stuff, which is very, very good, but like I've always said, is kind of wrapped up a little too much in detail, I feel like, for this class, but it's still very, very good. The one on Sikhism is going to be very important. Sikhism is going to be an important religion going forward. Also, I would recommend watching the one on Timur the Lame. This is one of the kind of great men of history aspects of history where you have a single individual, not unlike Genghis Khan, who really directs and takes control of the history of an entire region, mainly Persia and Central Asia, after, well, not after the fall of the Mongols, but as the Mongols kind of become complacent and fall into history, this is a new conqueror that arrives on the scene, and his offspring and his um, ancestors are going to form the foundation for these gunpowder empires that we're going to talk about going forward. Now, the first society that we're going to take a look at here is the Russian Empire. What we know as the Russian Empire is born in the late 1400s, out of a serious dislike for Mongol rule and Mongol control. Um, As we talked about in the last or 2 units ago, and John Green talks about in pretty good detail in the crash course, Mongol rule in Russia was different than it was in the other Khanates. The Mongols did not see anything of real value culturally or religiously or technologically in Russia. Also, the geography of Russia does not lend itself towards pastoral peoples. So the Mongols kind of ruled Russia from afar, and they essentially just bled the Russian cities dry for taxes. Now, certain Russian cities are able to take advantage of that distance between them and the Mongols, and they are able to exploit their position by kind of cozying up to the Mongols and becoming tax collectors on behalf of the Mongols. And one of the cities that really benefits from this is the city of Moscow, which is prior to the Mongol invasion, just one of a few cities. Not terribly significant. Before the Mongol invasion, the real powerhouse Russian city is Kiev. But Kiev resists the Mongols. They capture the city, loot it, basically raze it to the ground, as they do with a lot of big cities. And again, this creates a power vacuum. This creates an opening. And the city of Moscow and its leadership take full advantage of that. So after roughly about 150 years of kind of distance Mongol rule, the Prince of Moscow begins to put together an alliance of other Russian cities to resist the Mongol rulers in that area, which was known as the Golden Horde. In 1461, at Koroko River, the Russians win a major battle. They don't win complete independence from Mongol control, but they Moscow and several other of the larger cities in the alliance win the ability to basically stop paying Mongol taxes. The Mongols are still present in the area, and it won't be for another 40 years or so before the Russians are able to push them out completely. Now, Muscovy, which is the land and the state formed around the city of Moscow, once they are able to push the Mongols out of what they consider Russian lands, they begin slowly acquiring more and more territory around Muscovy. They subdue their other rival cities like Kiev, and eventually they are able to put together a relatively good size, centralized bureaucratic state surrounding Moscow. And the prince of Muscovy, in this case Ivan, declares himself as an autocrat and the first czar of the Russian Empire. And with this newfound authority and this newfound tax base, Moscow becomes the dominant Russian city. They begin spanning to the west into Ukraine, into Lithuania, into the Polish Empire. And over the next 300 years or so, they're going to bring millions of Poles and Slavs and Ukrainians and Germans and other ethnicities under their control. Now, militarily, this was somewhat difficult. Poland and Lithuania were large and rather strong kingdoms of their own at this point. But culturally, assimilating these conquered peoples into the Russian Empire was not nearly as difficult. Most of them were already Orthodox Christians, thanks to the work of Byzantine missionaries like, Methodius and Cyril. You also have a certain familiarity with the Russian language and the Russian alphabet, because many of these Slavic languages and Russian are based on the Cyrillic alphabet, which again was a byproduct of Byzantine missionaries. Now, on the other side of the Russian Empire, their expansion into the east towards Siberia and Central Asia was much easier militarily, but it was much more difficult culturally. Militarily, what they're up against here is mainly pastoral Turkic Mongol people who have converted mainly to Islam, right? So these again are pastoral peoples, meaning that they're relatively nomadic. They don't produce a lot of industry. And what they don't have a lot of at this point, because again, they don't really generate a lot of wealth, there's not a lot of specialized labor, is they don't have gunpowder weapons. Okay. And the Russian military is able to purchase gunpowder weapons via the Silk Road and via their contacts in Northern Europe. And those weapons make it relatively easy to dominate these pastoral nomadic people. Um, Now, in terms of the Russians, what are they looking for? Obviously, they're looking for land because land equals wealth. But there's also material wealth to the east, specifically in Siberia, which is a pretty vast wilderness. There is a healthy but not fully exploited fur trade going on in Central Asia and Siberia. There's also incredibly vast mineral resources. So over the next 300 years, the Russians are going to slowly but surely advance forward. They build basically a frontier of linked wooden forts as they push east to allow them to pacify and control the area, slowly but surely driving these pastoral people out of their homelands. Now, in order to ensure that these pastoral nomadic peoples properly assimilate into the Russian Empire, they also begin the process of what they call Russification, basically bringing Russian people, Russian culture, Russian language, Russian ways of life into these areas to not only politically assimilate the people in these lands, but to also culturally make them Russian, right? So conquered peoples are required to swear an oath to the Tsar. They pay a yearly tribute known as the yasak, generally in furs, because again, these are nomadic peoples. They don't really have any way to generate wealth. But one thing that they are not is they are not killed and they are not forcibly relocated. Now, many millions of these people relocate on their own because of the Russian advance. So you could kind of say that they are forcibly relocated, but the Russians don't, pick these people up and move them thousands of miles around the empire the way, say, the Mongols did. Another thing that the Russians do to encourage Russification as they move east into Central Asia and into Siberia is they also encourage the migration of ethnic Russians from the Russian homeland around Muscovy and Kiev and the Black Sea, and they entice them to migrate east to help with the process of Russification. Um, they do this by providing economic opportunities, offering free land or land at a greatly reduced price. They also offer tax breaks to people who are willing to move and set up businesses in these new lands. And for many of the kind of lower and working class Russians, this is a big opportunity because this is freedom from the kind of feudal peasant serfdom that they are locked into in Russia proper around Muscovy and things like that. Um, Another enticement is just the land itself. Um, Many of the people who migrate from the Russian homeland to the east are people who are not landowners in that area. And because of the vastness of the empire, this means that, similar to the land rush in the United States in the 1800s, you basically could just stake your claim. The first person to get to an area could stake their claim, start fencing off areas, and take the land essentially as their own. Another way that the Russians helped move this process of Russification along was that conquered peoples in these areas, who again were mostly Muslim, were pressured in different ways to accept Christianity. Similar to under Islam, there were tax breaks for those who converted more violently. In a lot of areas, mosques were destroyed and they were outlawed. Um, Christian men were encouraged to migrate east and to marry these Central Asian and Siberian women, which then would kind of cause a forcible conversion, essentially trying to breed breed Christianity into the area. In a lot of places, the Russian government kind of looked the other way and and allowed polygamy in a lot of areas where men were able to have multiple wives, because again, it helped to further Russify and bring Russian culture into the area. So this map gives you an idea of the um, expansion of the Russian Empire from the Battle of Kulikovo Bridge all the way up until almost the 19th century. Um, Now, what you can see here pretty quickly is that the expansion of this Russian Empire increases dramatically. Um, the state of Muscovy um, roughly triples in size in about the first 50 years. Over the next 50 years, it doubles in size again. Over the next 50 years after that, that's when you see the real explosion in the size of this Russian Empire. This is mainly under a couple of czars, Catherine and Peter the Great being the first that come to mind. But also, part of this is because of rapid innovation and development of gunpowder technology. The 1600s, the 17th century in Europe is kind of the golden age of gunpowder technology. This is when Europeans begin developing accurate and safe muskets. This is when cannon technology kind of starts to peak. And again, through their contacts in Northern Europe, the Russians are able to incorporate all of this gunpowder technology very rapidly into their military. And that helps them over this 200-year period to subdue incredibly large areas of Asia.